So let's see what it is that we can put together about Minion Eberhardt and why I would title a book America's Agatha Christie, Minion Good Eberhardt. She was born over in University Place, very near Nebraska Wesleyan, where I teach, and she attended Nebraska Wesleyan as well. Her father, Bill Good, was the owner of an ice manufacturing company back in the day when they would go to the Salt Valley Creeks and cut the blocks of ice and wrap them in burlap and put them in a sort of a basement area near at his manufacturing company, and then go about and sell it. So the Good family had quite a connection to both Nebraska Wesleyan and to University Place. Minion herself started writing pretty early on, and her first book, While the Patient in Room 18, was related to a hospital stay she had as a young person. She had a lot of time to kill, so to speak, and paid attention to what was going on or what she could detect in the hospital rooms around her, and ultimately published 2 books before the one we're considering. Over a 59 or 60-year career, as you can see, she published quite a number of novels, in addition to even having a play on Broadway at one point. Yes, it was mystery themed too. And she was published in 16 different languages, or her works. I think this is something really important to remember. Someone who has that long of a career and who starts off in the 1930s, really, serves, I think, as an important figure in terms of her ability to be a businesswoman at the time, to navigate what was a very different world in publishing, to gain a readership that was not only local or national, but worldwide, and to make a lot of money in the process. Her books are interesting in the mystery genre, but we come back to that question of Agatha Christie. Was she America's Agatha Christie? Well, a reviewer for the Miami newspaper thought so, or at least thought that was a clever way to so name her, and her publishers liked it because they put it on the back of a number of book jackets. Well, as an Agatha Christie fan, I got to thinking, how was she like Agatha Christie? As you can see from this slide, there are some others she knew. When you live your life through most of the 20th century, 1899 to 1996, you meet quite a number of people. Some of them are listed here, both Nebraska writers and folks that she met when she spent with her life with her husband in Chicago and on the East Coast. So I started wondering with this project how to answer the question that's posed in this early publicity advertisement. What was her secret? So, Agatha Christie, Minion Eberhardt, where do they connect? Where do they diverge? They were both pretty private about their lives. Christie had a disappearance in 1926. Eberhardt had a short-lived second marriage, about which even the most dogged biographer had a bit of trouble finding out information about. They both liked to control their public image. They had a lifelong commitment to theater and the opera, and they sold a lot of books. Now, there are some things that are different about both of them. Obviously, Christie has greater name recognition, and I would argue overall, probably superior characterization and plots, but Minion Eberhardt is worth reading. And not just the book that was selected for One Book, One Nebraska. There are a number of other works, I think, as well. There's a handout that I think got put on tables you might have in front of you that I put together some years ago because people ask, well, what should I read by Minion Eberhardt? So this put me to the task of categorizing her works, and I put them into both sort of chronological categories and some thematic categories that might be useful to think about. And the ones that I guess I would recommend, you know this from your own experience, how do you recommend a book to someone else? What you would enjoy, you might not. and vice versa. But I think the ones that I've selected, we could talk about this in the Q&A period, are probably worth reading because in terms of the quality of them within the mystery genre, I think they work. The themes are the Golden Age novels. If anyone from Nebraska knows about them, these are her earliest works. University of Nebraska Press did a wonderful job with Art Deco covers some years back of putting these together with wonderful introductions by Jay Fultz. And I think the Golden Age novels, every one of them, is worth reading. The early romance, there are also some interesting works among them. I didn't recommend any of them. I really like some of her World War II novels because Sarah Keat, the protagonist for which she is best known and who also appears in this novel for One Book, One Nebraska, makes a reappearance. And then finally, the experiences of her life in New York City and Connecticut appears in some of the later works. So you can take a look at those and perhaps you'll find something you would like to read. When you finish reading our One Book, One Nebraska selection, there are a couple of links at the bottom on the second page of the sheet that provide information on Turner Classic Movies, where you can go and review a movie trailer, which I would have liked to have shown you, but copyright prevents me, or see the entire movie. It's not as good as the book, but it's kind of fun after you've read the work. I do have some book jackets here of some of her early novels. The first two I've already mentioned. And I think Eberhardt did something really well in creating Nurse Sarah Keat, a middle-aged person who has an acerbic wit and an observant eye as a nurse, and finds herself helping solve mysteries with her friend, Detective Lance O'Leary. The Scotland, sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat. I think I spent too much time talking about phonetics in the previous hour. The Scotland Yard Prize that's mentioned was a promotional campaign by Doubleday. I don't think Scotland Yard has ever awarded prizes for mystery novels. I can just see the people around Scotland Yard saying, this is really great, we should give this our award. But it was a clever name for a prize, and it was a prize nonetheless. And $5,000 back in 1929 was, well, it's nothing to sniff at today, is it? Here is the original cover of The Mystery of Hunting's End. And I guess what I want to spend a little bit of time, and I'll try to, I think I'm not going to have to do any spoiler alerts for those of you who have yet to read the novel. But I think I can give you the scenario pretty easily. And then we'll talk about what's going on in this novel in terms of Eberhardt's craft, and do we see that going on in some of her other novels, as indeed we do. So there's a young woman named Mathilde Kingery, and her father, a wealthy businessman in Barrington, substitute Lincoln or Omaha perhaps, is up at the hunting lodge with a number of his business associates, and he's found dead from a gunshot wound. His daughter is understandably distraught, but everybody else convinces her, you know how the media is. Let's just leave this. This was a horrible accident, and not go further into the details. Well, 5 years later, this is still bothering Mathilde, and in an act of drama and also detective work, she decides, I'm going to invite this same group back to the Sand Hills, where the hunting lodge of her father is, and we're going to see if we can't figure this out. And I'm going to invite this detective I know of, Lance O'Leary, to be there as one of the guests undercover, to see what he can find out. And as it turns out, she has an aunt, the deceased's sister, who is wheelchair bound and is in need of a nurse. Enter Nurse Sarah Keat, who finds out from Lance O'Leary he's going to be there. And so they all arrive at this lodge near Valentine, in November. What could possibly go wrong with the weather? Well, you get this group of people together, tensions mount, people are angry at one another, there's all sorts of subtext going on, and of course, wouldn't you know it, someone is murdered. Well, that puts Nurse Keith and Lance O'Leary together, especially after a blizzard appears on the scene and prevents the coroner from arriving, any outside police help from showing up, and food's running low. The storm is bad. It lasts for days and days. What do you do? Let's talk about Mignon Eberhardt and what we might enjoy about some of her novels. No less than Gertrude Stein, who met Mignon Eberhardt on her Lectures in America tour in the 1930s, praised Eberhardt to Fanny Butcher, who was a book review editor for the Chicago Tribune, and said, you know, there's nobody who can paint a scene, who can create the atmospherics, who can describe what's going on like Mignon Eberhardt. With your indulgence, and hopefully with a better reading voice or speaking voice than I'm exhibiting now, let me read from the early pages of this novel. What is it like? What did Mignon Eberhardt think it was like when she left Lincoln with her husband, Alan, who was an engineer, young man who had trained at the University of Nebraska and worked for the Nebraska Department of Roads, building bridges all over the state. And at one point, they were stationed in Valentine. That's when Mignon Eberhardt got the idea to write this novel. What was it like when she and Alan first went out to the sand hills? Probably not unlike what Nurse Keith describes on the 12-hour train journey from Barrington to Nettleton. I sound nothing like a nurse, by the way, male or female. As I've indicated, the trip took exactly 12 hours, and I never knew any 12-hour journey to make such a difference in one's physical surroundings, unless it is the first 12 hours of an ocean voyage, when you go to sleep in harbor with the lights and surging motion of a city at hand, and awake in the middle of a trackless waste of water with boundless horizons. In fact, that portion of our country, which I believe is called the Sandhill Country and abounds in duck hunting, is not unlike the ocean in its loneliness, its immeasurable horizons, its effective existence bare of everything save still, swelling reaches of water and sky. But the waves were sandhills, rolling so boundlessly and silently that they gave an impression of incalculable power and strength, in whose grip I and the driver beside me and the little car which had met me at Nettleton were like paper toys, unreal and flat and entirely without meaning or value. And the sky was not blue, being instead a heavy leaden gray, which blended imperceptibly into the dun color of the far reaches of sand. And there was a track through the sand, only a track, however, along which the automobile pitched and lurched and struggled. I think I've been on that car ride at my grandparents' farm in years past, but this is how we get into the novel, and we get a real sense of the environment, which of course in itself is another character in this novel. So what does Mignon Eberhardt do to invite our close reading in this novel and other novels? Well, there's Nurse Keith herself, who has candid observations of other characters, and one need not read too closely to see what she or her creator, Mignon Eberhardt, is up to when she has Mignon describe a series of characters, all suspects, all initially potentially innocent, until the descriptions veer into the potential for there being a murderer. There are character exchanges that Eberhardt does really quite well. One doesn't grow up in the Midwest without knowing something about speech act theory, specifically indirect speech acts. There are details she provides that invite readers' reflection. When she tells us that Aunt Lucy has picked up sardonyx jewelry, and we remember, well, this is kind of an ancient stone that has a connection to Egypt, and that if you're into the healing powers of stones, which I am not, I am grateful for my medical care, but I also do not dismiss, let me say very quickly, you can take sardonyx stones and place them at the four corners of your room, I have read, and find healing properties in them. There's also a kind of protection against evil or wickedness. So Aunt Lucy knows this. Nurse Sarah Keat does not. Surprisingly, she doesn't like sardonyx. I think it's more an appearance-based response. Well, there's the atmospheric creation of scenes that Gertrude Stein noted. There's the friendship between Detective O'Leary and Nurse Sarah Keat that is playful. The detective is younger than Nurse Keat, but they have some banter worthy of other writers, I think, characters by other writers. And finally, it's a mystery novel after all, O'Leary's ability to interview the suspects. Let me show you just a few excerpts of those and see what you make of them that might inform what we're doing in a bit with our Q&A session. So Nurse Keat looks at a photograph that was taken of the group 5 years ago, and she wonders, what's happened to these people? I've bold-faced some places where she seems, I'll not read the whole passage, changes in appearance. I found myself studying the faces about me, comparing them with the picture taken 5 years ago. Who had changed? How? Helene was much stouter. Was that why her eyes looked craftier, less languishing? The little Baroness had possibly had 5 years of rather difficult financial battles. Had it been that which had laid layers of paint on her face and had dyed her hair so crassly gold and had given her hard little fingers that clutching, grasping look? Had that 5 years alone made Julian Bayer's handsome eyes more discreet than ever? And so on and so forth. She takes on the male characters as well. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be under the observant eye of Nurse Keat. Well, here's a little exchange between two of the men, both of whom we later discover seem to have been paying a lot of attention to Mathilde, the younger woman whose father died. One is Joe Paggi, the opera singer, or Paggi. Aren't we going to have some music, suggested Lal Killian. How about it, Joe? Paggi shrugged. I'll sing if my wife will accompany me. I don't want you, Lal. How do you know I was going to offer my service? Asked Lal lazily. He was standing beside Mathilde's chair, looking rather fixedly at the feather fan. It now trailed extravagantly over her arm, making the soft flesh look whiter than ever by comparison. As a matter of fact, I was not, though you might do worse. And I can do better. You make everything sound like a dance tune. So there's a bit of snippish behavior among some of the male characters as well as the female. But what I really like is what Gertrude Stein talked about, and that is, you could even close your eyes as I read the next passage. Please do open them again, lest you give me the wrong impression. Minion Eberhardt captures a scene in the corner of the room, and I think she does it very nicely. From the piano, we could hear occasional words from Helene and Killian, and now and then a phrase or two of music, and Helene's voice humming lightly. There was the little whisper of cards falling, and a few words from the bridge players. Paggi's comments to Mathilde grew lower and lower, and once, as his hand slipped lightly upon hers and turned it so that their palms met for a second before she withdrew her own, it seemed to me that a flush rose to her cheeks and lingered there, and her eyes began to shine a little feverishly. Again, Nurse Sarah Keat pays attention to what's going on and captures this scene among this group rather well. But of course, this is a mystery novel, a murder mystery. People die. not by their own choosing. So how would you like to be in Nurse Keats' position here, where again, the description captures a sort of trademark of Eberhard? I've never known what awakened me. It may have been a current of air on my face, a rustle, a feeling of movement, but whatever it was, I awoke very suddenly, with my heart standing quite still and then leaping madly. Someone was in the room. Someone was standing beside the bed. Something under my pillow was moving. I was frozen. I could not raise my head. I could not scream. That hand I had shot was under my pillow. I knew it. It must be. And I think my own hand must have clutched under the pillow too, for I knew suddenly that that other hand was hot and curiously sticky and wet. Well, I don't know about you, but that's not the sort of thing I like to be awakened to. Eberhard does, in another biography I wrote of a suspense writer, Charlotte Armstrong, that perhaps I'll have the chance to talk with you about one day, this notion of creating suspense is all about timing. We were talking about prosodic signals, the prosody and phonology and linguistics class, and indeed, pause, pitch, rate, emphasis does the job. I think Mignon Eberhard had a keen ear. She had an inner ear, knowing that some of the pieces, some of her writings she composed would work well. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to pass over the slide of O'Leary and Keats' friendship and O'Leary's interviewing suspects, though those are both a lot of fun, to watch the ways in which he sort of captures those he's interviewing, much like an attorney with a witness on the stand. All of the Nurse Keats novels were big hits with Eberhardt's readers and big hits in terms of being sold. I want to mention to you, though, a little bit more about Mignon Eberhardt. She had a short story character that I'm really quite fond of. Had the opportunity to edit a collection of her short stories that had been previously uncollected. And if Nurse Sarah Keat was her best-known character in terms of novels, then Susan Dare, who only appeared in short stories, was her best short story character. Susan Dare prefigured Jessica Fletcher by about 60 years. Susan Dare is a young woman in her 20s who, like Eberhardt, became a best-selling murder mystery writer. Well, you know, if you're going to be writing about that, you're inevitably, when you get together with your friends, going to wind up at a place where somebody gets murdered, and there won't be anybody but you to solve it based upon your writing experience. That's the case of Susan Dare, who, again, a lot of fun, and yet maybe another alter ego of Mignon Eberhardt. I've mentioned about the Gertrude Stein quotation. The House on the Roof is another fun novel from that early period of Eberhardt's to read, taking place in Chicago, involving an opera singer. Mignon Eberhardt was a regular at the opera during that time, at the Civic Opera House. You know it, you see it right whenever you're in Chicago. Another of her works, The Dark Garden, is, I think, one of the last things I'm going to mention to you. This is the passage I am confident that so took Gertrude Stein. And we know Stein was a real modernist. Mignon Eberhardt was not so much. She was kind of a romantic, interested in the Gothic. And nonetheless, in this passage, I think we see some futuristic elements that might have been really attractive to Gertrude Stein. If you've ever been to Chicago when the fog rolls in, this might be familiar to you, except for the design of the cars, perhaps. The fog reached Michigan Boulevard and blanketed the loop. It didn't announce its coming. All at once, it was just there, gray, shifting, stifling, holding sounds and smoke and motor exhaust gas close to the damp and glistening pavements. Lights were on everywhere and gleamed weirdly and futilely out of the thick gray veils. Traffic was impeded, pedestrians confused. Bus drivers felt their thunderous way along, foot by foot. Private chauffeurs, harassed by dangers from without and instructions from within, cursed in their hearts and pretended to have gone suddenly deaf. Taxi drivers, a perverse lot, became merry and took hairbreadth chances and shouted gaily at one another. Traffic policemen went quietly mad under their solemn, glimmering raincoats and clung to their whistles as if whistle-blowing were the only stable thing left in a ghoulish and unbelievably fluid world. The throbbing of the motors, the wailing of newsboys, the squeal of brakes, and the long, mellow notes of auto horns interwove and blended and echoed themselves confusedly among fog walls, a shifting pandemonium of sound, with the shrill two notes of police whistles piercing eerily in and out and through and above it all. Well, Death in the Fog was quite popular, not only here, but just as a reminder of Minion Eberhardt's career, it was published in magazine form. Many of her works, like those of Dickens, were serialized in newspapers, the Toronto Star being a big fan, and there were publications both in the United States and in England. The Scandinavians loved mysteries, hence all of those different works. During the Depression, Allen and Minion wound up in the Alps Maritime, which prompted her first novel set internationally, The White Cockatoo, and has the distinction, only 2 novels did she have a male protagonist character. Well, there are a lot of things that we could say about Minion Eberhardt, and I think I'd prefer to have you discover some of them from your reading of her works. She was no nonsense. I think she remained a practical Midwesterner to the end. She was a businesswoman who wrote to live. She protected her privacy. And she was an artist who transformed events in the world around her into motives for murder. I argued in the biography that a mirror was one way of understanding her. She did a little bit of reframing of her life. Her father was no longer the Iceman, but the owner of a small manufacturing company. In her later novels, she didn't grow up in a small Midwestern capital city, but a Western university town. So, the business world of publishing was ever present in her mind as well. What is her significance? I hinted a bit of this at the beginning of the talk. She was an early female mystery writer, paving the way. And now in Women's History Month, I think she's an important person to talk about. She introduced strong female characters with common sense and moxie, and both of those would apply to Nurse Sarah Keat and Susan Dare, as well as some of her other characters. She published in Good Housekeeping and a host of other magazines connected with the Butterwick Sewing Company, some not, in the 1930s and 40s, when that was a way of building your reading audience as well. And she made her way in a publishing world that was dominated by men. And if you read a lot of her novels, decade by decade, you get some references to things that you might have forgotten about or never known. Because like other writers, Minion Eberhardt built these cultural touchstones into her novels. And they're references without footnotes, but if you start wondering, well, what's that about? You might find yourself not chasing down a rabbit hole, but finding an interesting historical matter that you didn't know about. With that, I'll stop and I'll invite any questions you might have. Thank you again for coming. It's been my pleasure to spend this time with you. Yes, there was a question.
How old was she when she wrote her first book?
She was in her late 20s, so yeah. And she said in Valentine, she gathered up courage and postage stamps and sent off her first story, which was, I had a nurse named Mary Eden, and so it was more of a novelette that was published. So she had some of these early works of shorter fiction published. Yes, yes.
So how were you introduced to her work, and how did you become interested in her work?
Thank you for asking that question. It gives me a chance to pay homage to one of our alums of Nebraska Wesleyan, Betty Dyer, who for many years went around. She was part of the Speakers Bureau for the Humanities Council and went about the state telling people about Minion Eberhart. When Betty was at Nebraska Wesleyan, she had been in Alpha Gamma Delta, and that was a sort of a modern version of the Theophanian Girls, which Minion Eberhart had been a member of a literary society when she was at Nebraska Wesleyan. And so as a kind of sorority sister, separated by a few decades, Betty wanted to keep her name alive, and was doing so even while Minion was still alive. She had conversations with her. Sadly, I did not have that opportunity. She came onto my radar later from Betty, who herself was a force of nature and wanted to honor Minion at one of our homecoming events at Wesleyan. She had asked one of my colleagues, and he had said, I don't have time to do this. But I read one of Minion's novels, I believe it was While the Patient Slept, and created a murder mystery game, sort of transformed the novel into a sort of a reader's theater opportunity where you could stop at certain points and try to figure out, okay, who do we think done it, as it were. And that was kind of a hit at the homecoming. Betty was pleased with it and came back to me later and said, don't you think Minion's a good writer? I said, oh, sure, she is. She's a lot of fun. She said, don't you think a biography ought to be written about her? You see, Betty was a little bit like Lance O'Leary. She would kind of lay these traps. And I said, sure, so yeah, somebody should do that. And Betty said, well, why don't you do it? And I changed my sabbatical plans. I thought, well, should I do this? And it turned into a great adventure, visiting archives at Columbia University, at Boston University, and my friend and colleague Martha had to slip away, but Newberry Library Archives had a trove of letters from Fanny Butcher, God bless you, Fanny, the literary editor at the Chicago Trib. And it takes a while. Librarians have a lot of work to do, and sometimes these treasure troves don't become available. They had just become available. And a librarian at the Chicago Public Library said, I just read in maybe a listserv or something, I think Fanny Butcher's papers are available. It did not take me long to get there. She had saved all of Minion's letters. So I had kind of a one-sided conversation. It wasn't what Fanny had written back to Minion, but I learned a lot more. And that was toward the end of the project. So it was a bit like a mystery itself, putting pieces together and figuring out what happened. That was a much longer response than you needed, but the noun professor comes from the verb profess. And so anyway, but Betty Dyer got me started on this project, and I'll always be grateful to her for that. There was another question, I think. Yes?
When did she leave Nebraska, and why did she leave?
She was in Nebraska through the early mid-30s. Her husband was employed by the Nebraska Department of Roads, and then she had the opportunity to move on to Chicago and later the East Coast. Part of the reason for the move, I believe her husband Alan had the opportunity as an engineer, but not the toot kind, to help lay the tracks. So if you ever take the train into Chicago, the original design of Union Station was the efforts of a team that he was a part of. So it was employment on his part and a writer being able to work anywhere. They lived in Oak Park, and I should mention one of her sorority sisters was Grace Hefner, whose son you might have heard of by the surname. And Hugh Hefner was born in an apartment complex. The Hefners and the Eberharts lived next to each other. So Minion knew Hugh from an early age. And at one point, when asked about his publication, she said, you know, they don't seem to be much more lurid than some of the things in these New York newspapers sold on the street corners. So that was her take, at any rate. But yeah, they moved because of employment and then lived primarily in Chicago, in New York City. She had a penthouse at one point. And if you live at a penthouse and you're looking at the ledge, you can guess what one of the murders in one of her future novels would involve. Also in suburban Connecticut, in New Jersey at one point, and of course their time abroad during the Depression in France early on. Yes, there was a question.
When you're doing a biography, you have different questions, and I'm sure if you interviewed people who are living or if you did research, but do you have a research question? My daughter is writing a book that happens in like Roman period time, so she's going to be interviewing historians, but we're looking for particular questions that we can draw out, you know, characters from 2,000 years ago. So do you have a particular question that you're either asking directly or indirectly to pull out some of these things that you would normally find?
Well, I think two things. I did interview people who were living. Minion's, she had one sister, Lula, and Lula had a son, Bill Vogelsang, who was a professor of physics, I believe, at University of Wisconsin. He recently passed away, but I did have the chance to interview him and his wife, Barbara, someone who had actually met her. Minion had a lot of friends that I needed to track down, so I needed to find who do I want to interview. Ms. Justice Lawrence on Park Avenue, whose husband had been in the Eisenhower administration, also was a friend of Minion. Carlene Roberts, Mrs. Justice Lawrence, was the first female executive of American Airlines in the 1940s and 50s. So it was interesting talking to her about her early experiences there as well, and other friends of Minion. So I did manage to make those close connections with Rome. It's a little more challenging, but what I did find in interviewing is how important it is not only to come up with those good questions and to do research ahead of time about the person I'm going to interview, because you don't want to take up someone's time with questions that you could find out otherwise. So that's the first thing. The other thing is the importance of follow-up questions. I think listening closely, because there's going to be a word or a phrase that you're not going to expect that may lead you to another question. So those would be two bits of information, and good luck on your project. After writing a couple of biographies and working with my mother, who had been a school teacher, on her memoir, I finally realized on my last sabbatical, I should probably teach a biography and memoir class, which I just did this last fall, and there were so many wonderful young people with great projects of their own. So it's an interesting endeavor to start out on. I think you'll have a lot of fun. There was another question, I think, maybe or maybe not. Yes, sir.
I was glad one of your later slides mentioned her wicked sense of humor, because I wanted to laugh at some of the passages you read. Do you have any comments on her style of humor? How it works?
I would say, as you can tell, she understood indirect speech acts. She understood how to bring out the sort of snippy, acerbic character of Nurse Keat. And I expect, from people I talked to, Minion Eberhardt herself was quick-witted, but it was very low-key and understated. And I think her zingers, as I like to imagine, probably sailed by, and it might have taken people a moment or two to realize, oh, well. So yeah, I think she did have a nice sense of humor, and one of her funny lines was, well, I heard this one writer say that he was writing for posterity. I myself am writing for prosperity. So playing around a little bit with language was very much a part of what Minion's humor involved. So, yes.
So is there any evidence that as a younger person she was pretty facile with language, and then was that honed at Wesleyan, or where did that develop?
Well, I'm sure some of my colleagues at Wesleyan would like me to say, yes, thanks to Wesleyan. Come to Wesleyan and become facile with language. We do our best in the English department. I think we do pretty well, but Minion, in fact, is it this one? Sorry. I believe, yeah, the dedication in The Mystery at Hunting's Inn is for Lou, L-O-U. Lou, who knows about the paper dolls. Okay, so I'm going to kill two birds with one stone here. There's the humor, because if you've got a bit of a wicked turn of a mind, and I'm sorry, if you're going to write about murder mysteries, you have to have a little bit of a wicked turn of mind. Who are these paper dolls if we're going to play around with ambiguity? And who is Lou, and what's that all about? Now I'm quoting Charles Schlesinger, one of Minion's literary agents who I got to interview in New York. But it's Lula, or Lulu, her sister, Lulu Vogelsang. And when Minion and Lou were little girls, they would play with paper dolls. Lou liked to cut out the outfits for them, probably a Schiaparelli gown and some Ferragamo shoes, you know. And Minion made up the stories about them. So that was the game for her. When Lulu got the characters dressed, she was done. Minion, the game's just beginning. What are they doing? What are they going to say to each other? So I think, yeah, from a very early childhood, there's that story, that anecdote about this tradition. And then when Minion was at Nebraska Wesleyan, I'm sure, and in high school, she was at Jackson High, now the site of Huntington Elementary. I'm sure classes that she took, she leaned more toward the classes in literature. She loved Shakespeare. She was quite an avid reader.
So I'm Diane Wilson. I'm curator of the Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors downstairs, and I just want to thank Rick very much for this great talk today and give him just a little token of our appreciation, a Heritage Room coffee mug.
Thank you very much. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.